The dress Mommy chose for me was blue, the color of the sky on a happy day. But there was nothing happy about that morning. It was the kind of dress with a stiff collar that scratched my neck, the kind you only wear for important, scary things. Mommy's eyes were red and puffy, even though she tried to smile at me in the mirror. She said we had to go to a big building downtown to talk to a judge. The word divorce was a grown-up word, heavy and sharp, and it had been living in our house for months, making the air thick and hard to breathe. It meant that Mommy and Daddy wouldn't be married anymore. It meant our family was breaking, and I didn't know how to stop it. Daddy hadn't lived with us for a while. His side of the closet was empty, and his scratchy brown armchair just gathered dust in the corner of the living room. At first, he would call every night to say goodnight. His voice would come through the phone, sounding far away and thin. He'd say, "I love you, sweet pea." But then the calls started coming less and less. Sometimes a whole week would go by, and the phone would stay quiet. Mommy would see me looking at it, and her face would get that tight, sad look again. She would hug me and say, "Daddy's just very busy, Sophie." But I knew it was more than that. Grown-ups think kids don't understand, but we do. We feel everything. We feel the silence where laughter used to be. The car ride to the courthouse was quiet. Mommy held my hand, her fingers cold even though it was summer. I stared out the window at the blurry trees, thinking about the last time I'd seen Daddy. It was for my 8th birthday. He had brought me a big wrapped gift, but he didn't stay for the party. He gave me a quick, stiff hug that didn't feel like his real hugs and said he had an important meeting. Later, when I opened the gift, it was a doll I already had. It was like he didn't know me anymore. That night, after my party, I couldn't sleep. I tiptoed to the living room to get a glass of water and heard Mommy crying on the phone. She was talking to Grandma. "He doesn't even care, Mom," she whispered. "He has a new life, a whole new family." I didn't understand what a whole new family meant, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. A few days later, a strange thing happened. A letter came in the mail for Daddy, but it was from a place we didn't know. Mommy looked at it for a long time and then put it on the kitchen counter. I was curious. When she went to take a shower, I carefully picked it up. My hands were trembling. Inside, there was a picture. It fell out onto the floor, face up. It was a picture of Daddy, but he wasn't alone. He was standing next to a lady with bright blonde hair, and he was holding the hand of a little boy. The boy was smiling, showing a gap where a tooth was missing. Daddy's arm was around the lady, and he was smiling a huge, happy smile I hadn't seen in forever. They looked like a family, a happy one. My heart felt like it had turned into a little cold stone in my chest. I quickly folded the picture, my fingers creasing the strange lady's smiling face, and hid it in the pocket of my pajama pants. I never told Mommy I saw it. It was my secret, a heavy, confusing secret. When we got to the courthouse, Daddy was already there, talking to a man in a suit. He looked different. His face was hard like a mask. He glanced at us, and his eyes didn't have any light in them when he looked at me. It was like looking at a stranger. Mommy squeezed my hand tighter. "It's going to be okay, baby," she whispered, but her voice was shaky. They went into a small room to talk before seeing the judge. Mommy told me to wait on a long wooden bench just outside. The door was left a little bit open, and I could hear their voices. First, it was just a low murmur. Then Daddy's voice got louder. I couldn't help it. I crept closer, my blue shoes silent on the shiny floor. "You can't be serious, Catherine," Daddy said, his voice sharp and cold. "You're not getting the house. You're not getting anything more than what the law requires." "Robert, please," Mommy's voice was pleading. "This is Sophie's home. She needs stability. I just want what's fair for her." Then Daddy said the words that burned into my memory. He leaned forward, and even from the hallway, I could feel the anger coming off him. His voice was a low, mean hiss. "You're not getting a cent. I'll make sure of it. You and that kid will have nothing from me." That kid. He called me that kid. Not Sophie, not Sweet Pea. It was like a slap. All the air went out of my body. My father, the man who used to lift me up to the sky and call me his princess, didn't want me anymore. He had a new family now, a new life, and he wanted to leave us with nothing. In that moment, standing in the cold, quiet hallway, I felt the little stone in my chest grow hard and heavy, and I remembered the picture, folded up small, now tucked safely in the secret pocket of my blue dress. Mommy came out of the room a few minutes later, her face pale and her hands shaking. She didn't look at me, just took my hand and led me into the big courtroom. It was even scarier than I imagined. The room was huge, with dark wood walls that went all the way up to a high ceiling. A man in a long black robe sat on a big chair, looking down at everyone. That must be the judge, I thought. He looked serious, like a principal. but even more important. We sat at a long table, and Mommy's lawyer, a kind lady named Mrs. Davis, gave my arm a little squeeze. Daddy and his lawyer sat at another table across from us. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared straight ahead at the judge, his jaw set like a stone. The room was quiet, except for the rustling of papers and the low hum of the lights. I felt so small, like a bug in a giant's house. I clutched the secret pocket of my dress, the folded picture inside a tiny, sharp square against my leg. That kid! The words echoed in my head, louder than the judge's voice. He called me that kid. He didn't want me. He had a new son, a new family, and he wanted to erase us. Mrs. Davis started talking first. She spoke about how Mommy had been a good wife and a wonderful mother. She told the judge that Mommy had quit her job as a teacher to take care of me when I was born, and that she needed support to get back on her feet and give me a good life. She said we needed to stay in our house because it was the only home I had ever known. Her voice was calm and steady. Then it was Daddy's lawyer's turn. He was a man with a booming voice that filled the whole room. He said things that weren't true. He said Mommy was lazy and didn't want to work. He said Daddy had worked very hard for his money and that Mommy was trying to take it all. He painted my father as a victim, a man being taken advantage of. Daddy just sat there, nodding along, his face grim. It felt like I was watching a play. A very bad play where the actors were saying terrible things about my mom. I looked at Mommy. A single tear was rolling down her cheek, but she sat up straight and tall, trying to be brave. I wanted to hug her, to tell her it wasn't true, but I was frozen in my chair. The anger inside me started to bubble up, hot and fizzy like a soda can shaken too hard. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. The judge listened to both of them, his face unreadable. Then he looked at my father. "Mr. Collins," the judge said, his voice calm but firm, "your financial records show significant expenditures over the past year. Can you explain these large regular payments to an individual not listed in your initial financial declarations?" Daddy's lawyer stood up quickly. "Your Honor, those are business expenses. My client has a consulting business, and those are payments to a subcontractor." Daddy nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor. Strictly business." A lie. It was a big, fat lie. I knew it. The secret picture in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. That kid. The words came back, and this time, they brought a hot flash of courage with them. My dad was lying to a judge. He was lying about everything. He was lying about the money, and he was lying about his life. And he was doing it so he could leave me and Mommy with nothing. The judge seemed to think for a moment. He looked at my father, then at the papers in front of him. "And this address, where the payments are sent? Is this a business address?" Daddy hesitated for just a second. "Yes, Your Honor. It's the office of the subcontractor." My heart was beating so fast it felt like a drum inside my chest. Thump, thump, thump. I looked at Mommy. She looked defeated, like she was about to give up. I looked at Daddy. He looked smug, confident that he was going to win. He was going to walk away from us, back to his new family, and leave us behind in the rubble of our old one. And that's when I knew I couldn't be quiet anymore. I couldn't be the good little girl who sits still and says nothing. The little stone of hurt in my chest wasn't a stone anymore. It was a hot, burning coal. My hand, without me even telling it to, reached into the secret pocket of my dress. My fingers closed around the folded, crinkled picture. It was just a small piece of paper, but right then, it felt like the only weapon I had, the only piece of truth in a room full of lies. Mrs. Davis was about to say something, but I didn't wait. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood up. Everyone turned to look at me. Mommy's eyes went wide. Daddy's face, for the first time that day, showed a flicker of shock, then panic. The judge looked down at me from his big high chair, his eyebrows raised in surprise. The whole giant room was suddenly silent, waiting, and all they could see was a little girl in a blue dress who was about to show them all the truth. "Sophie, sit down," Mommy whispered, her voice tight with panic. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I kept my eyes on the judge. My hand was shaking so much I could barely get the picture out of my pocket. It felt slippery in my sweaty palm. "What is it, young lady?" the judge asked. His voice wasn't angry, just curious. He leaned forward a little. I didn't say anything. I just walked. My blue shoes with the little bows on them seemed so loud on the shiny floor. Click, clack, click, clack. I walked past my table, past Mrs. Davis, who was watching me with her mouth slightly open. I walked towards the judge's big desk, which felt like a mountain. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father. He looked like a ghost. His face was white, and his eyes were wide with a kind of fear I had never seen on him before. He started to stand up, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, holding him down. Your Honor, this is highly irregular, Daddy's lawyer boomed. The child is being coached. This is a stunt by the mother to gain sympathy. Mommy gasped. That's not true. I had no idea. Sophie, please. But I ignored them all. I kept my eyes on the judge. When I finally reached his desk, I had to stand on my tiptoes to put the picture on the smooth, dark wood. My hand was still trembling. I unfolded the crinkled paper carefully. The smiling faces of my father, the blonde lady, and the little boy looked up at the high ceiling. The judge picked up the picture. He held it for a long time, his face completely blank. The silence in the room was so deep I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow like a little bird's. He looked at the picture. Then he looked at my father. He did this 2 or 3 times. Mr. Collins, the judge said, and his voice was different now. It was cold and sharp, like ice. You identified this address as a business location for a subcontractor. Is that correct? Daddy didn't answer right away. He just stared at the picture in the judge's hand. His lawyer was whispering furiously in his ear. Mr. Collins, the judge repeated louder this time. Answer the question. Yes, Daddy finally mumbled. His voice was so quiet I could barely hear it. A home office. The judge placed the photograph down on his desk, but he kept one finger on it, as if to pin it in place. And this woman, he said, tapping the blonde lady's face. Is this your subcontractor? Daddy swallowed hard. He looked like he was choking. He glanced at my mommy, who was watching him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He looked at me just for a second, and in his eyes, I saw everything. The lies, the guilt, the panic. It was all there. And this boy, the judge continued, his voice relentless like a hammer. Is he also part of your business? The room was completely still. Daddy's lawyer was pale. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked broken. The mask he had been wearing all day had cracked and fallen away, and underneath was just a scared, weak man. He had built a whole new life on a mountain of lies, and a little girl with a secret picture had just made the whole thing come tumbling down. My father started, his voice cracking. I can explain. I'm sure you can, the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked from my father to my mother, and then he looked at me. His face softened just a little when he looked at me. He picked up the picture again and held it so only he could see it. Mrs. Davis, I believe we have some new information to consider regarding Mr. Collins's financial declarations and his credibility. We will take a brief recess. I want to see both counsels in my chambers immediately. And Mr. Collins, the judge said, his eyes locking onto my father's, hard and unforgiving. You would be wise to reconsider the offer you made to your wife. You would be very, very wise to do so. He banged his gavel, a loud crack that made me jump. And just like that, it was over. Daddy slumped in his chair, covering his face with his hands. Mommy started to cry, but this time, they weren't sad tears. They were the tears you cry when something heavy has finally been lifted. Mrs. Davis rushed over and put her arms around my mom. I just stood there, in the middle of the huge, empty-feeling room. I had done it. I had told the truth. I looked at my father, a man I once thought was the strongest person in the world, now looking so small and defeated. And I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt empty. The burning coal in my chest had turned to ash. I had won, I think. But it didn't feel like winning at all. Mommy rushed to my side, her arms wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe, as if she was trying to put back together all my broken pieces with her hug alone. She buried her face in my hair, and I could feel her tears, warm and wet on my scalp. "Oh, Sophie," she sobbed, her voice thick with a mix of relief and sorrow that I could feel vibrating through her body. "My brave, brave girl. I'm so sorry. I'm so, so sorry you had to do that. You shouldn't have had to." Mrs. Davis joined our huddle, her hand rubbing my back in a gentle circle. "You were incredibly courageous, Sophie," she said softly, her voice full of respect. "You told the truth when the grown-ups were lying. That's the most important thing in the world." Across the room, my father was still sitting at his table. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. His lawyer was talking to him, his hands moving emphatically, his face red with anger. But Daddy didn't seem to be listening. He just stared at the polished surface of the table, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. He looked like a hollow man. He didn't look at us. Not once. It was like a thick glass wall had come down between us, and he was on one side, and Mommy and I were on the other, in a completely different world. Mrs. Davis and Mommy went with the judge into the small room, the one they called his chambers. I waited on the same wooden bench as before, but this time I didn't feel scared. I just felt tired, a deep down kind of tired that made my bones ache and my eyelids feel like they were made of lead. The blue dress felt heavy and wrong, and the collar was scratching my neck again. I just wanted to go home, take it off, and put on my old soft pajamas. Walking out of the courthouse was strange. The sun was so bright it made me squint, and the sounds of the city, the cars honking, people talking, felt too loud after the thick silence of the courtroom. It felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel. On the drive home, Mommy was quiet for a long time. She just held my hand, her fingers warm this time, tracing little patterns on my palm. I watched the world go by, but everything looked different. The trees seemed a sadder shade of green. The houses looked lonely. Finally, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We're going to be okay, Sophie. We get to keep the house, our home, and I'm going to get enough support to take care of us while I go back to school to become a teacher again. She squeezed my hand, her eyes still on the road. It's all because of you. You saved us. I kept looking out the window. The words that had been stinging me all day finally came out. He called me that kid, I said quietly, the words tasting like something rotten in my mouth. Mommy's breath hitched, a sharp, painful sound. She pulled the car over to the side of the road so suddenly that the tires crunched on the gravel. She turned in her seat and gathered me in her arms right there in the front of the car. He was wrong, Sophie, she said fiercely, her voice shaking with a protective anger I had never heard before. He was a coward, and he said a cruel, terrible thing because he was trying to hurt me, and he used you to do it. It had nothing to do with you, do you understand? You are my sun and my moon and all my stars. You are my everything. I buried my face in her shoulder and the dam inside me finally broke. I let myself cry. I cried for my broken family, for the daddy who used to throw me in the air and call me his princess, for the new, smiling family in the picture, and for the little girl who had to learn that heroes can break their promises. The first few months after the divorce were the strangest. The house was quieter without the shouting, but the silence was heavy sometimes, full of ghosts. I would sometimes catch myself listening for the sound of Daddy's key in the lock around dinner time, a habit that left a hollow ache in my stomach. Mommy was busy. She enrolled in classes and spent her nights studying at the kitchen table, books and papers spread out all around her like a fortress. But she was different. One evening, I heard her humming while she did the dishes, a little tune she hadn't hummed in years. A few weeks after that, we spent a whole Saturday painting my bedroom bright sunny yellow. We put on music and danced, and our laughter echoed in the empty spaces of the house, chasing the ghosts away. We were a team now, a new kind of family. One afternoon, a letter came in the mail. It was a thin, white envelope, and my name was written on the front in my father's messy, familiar handwriting. My heart did a funny little flip-flop, like it couldn't decide whether to be happy or scared. I took it to my room and sat on my bed, turning it over and over. I hid it in my drawer for 2 whole days, afraid of what might be inside. Was it more angry words? More lies? Finally, on a rainy afternoon, I built a little fort with my pillows and blankets, and in that safe, soft space, I opened it. The note inside was short. Dear Sophie, it said, I am so sorry. There are no words to tell you how sorry I am for the pain I caused you. I was wrong. I was a coward, and I was a fool. What I said and did was unforgivable, but I am asking you for your forgiveness anyway. I miss you more than you can imagine. I love you, sweet pea. I always will. Love, Daddy. The note was smudged in one spot, a tiny blur on the ink, like a teardrop had fallen and dried. I read it 10 times, maybe more. I love you, sweet pea. The words were there, but they felt like an echo from a life that wasn't mine anymore. He had a new family, a new life, a son whose parties he didn't miss. The apology was real. I could feel it, but it didn't magically fix the hole in my chest. It just made it ache in a different way. I folded the letter and put it in a small wooden box where I kept my treasures. A pretty rock, a bird's feather, a friendship bracelet. I didn't show it to Mommy. This secret felt different. It wasn't heavy with lies. It was mine. My sadness, my confusion, and maybe someday, my forgiveness. Maybe one day I would be ready to see him again. But not today. Today, my mom and I were going to make pizza from scratch, and we would probably get more flour on the floor than in the bowl. Today, we were building a new life, not on a mountain of lies, but on the steady ground of our love for each other. It wasn't the life I had before, but it was real, and it was ours. We had faced the truth and survived. And for a little girl who had learned too much about the messy world of grown-ups, that felt like the most important victory of all. Even in the middle of life's most painful moments, you can find your own strength, a courage you never knew you had. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply tell the truth, even if your voice shakes. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a message of hope.